The night I celebrated my 25th birthday, my parents took me to a restaurant not to honor me, but to calculate my worth and find it lacking. My mother selected the venue, a place I had never stepped foot in before. Her choice of the Harrington should have been my first red flag. Margaret Ellison never chose a location without a hidden agenda that ultimately served her bottom line. She wore her charcoal wool blazer, the one she reserved for memorial services and corporate negotiations. My father, Thomas, had made the booking under her surname, which I caught when the hostess asked, and he answered before I could form a word. No decorations adorned our table. No balloons drifted near my chair. No cake waited in the back with my name written in frosting. The table was conspicuously empty, and the atmosphere between my parents carried the strained courtesy of individuals about to deliver a judgment. I had worked in settings like this for years. I had arranged tables for clients, for contract signings, for the hushed conversations families have when death arrives and assets must be redistributed. I recognized the difference between a celebration and an interrogation. This evening had the sterile chill of the latter. So, I did what I always do when the temperature plummets. I monitored my breathing and mentally mapped every exit. That was when I spotted the small brass marker on the table behind my mother and slightly to the left. Table 7. I registered it without understanding why, the way you notice a signpost before you realize you'll need to retrace your steps. I placed a plain manila folder next to my water glass. My mother gave it a fleeting glance and dismissed it as a work document. She had no clue what I had sealed inside. To grasp why I remained composed, you need to understand what birthdays looked like in our household. When I was young, my birthday was symbolized by a single candle. Not the number candle families use for milestones, just a lone taper jammed into a supermarket cupcake my mother picked up on her drive home. I would watch it melt on the counter while she answered phone calls. Meanwhile, 3 weeks later, my cousin Ethan received a rented inflatable castle and a caterer serving miniature quiches because Ethan was my Aunt Patricia's son, and Ethan was blood. I recall asking at age 8 if I could have a party of my own. My aunt was visiting, drinking my mother's wine, and she replied on my mother's behalf. "We can only manage one special event a month, sweetheart," she said it with kindness. That was the detail that taught me the most. How gently people can articulate your limitations. I absorbed the arithmetic. A single cupcake costs significantly less than an entire celebration. A child who asks for less costs less than a child who demands equality. By age 9, I had ceased requesting cake because I understood it simplified the ledger for everyone present, and being uncomplicated felt like my only bargaining chip. I didn't label it sadness. I labeled it practicality. That is the hidden cost of growing up useful. You remain unaware of your valuation until someone announces the final number. And across that white linen at the Harrington at 25, I could sense my mother preparing to speak that number aloud. I departed that household at 18 with 2 bags and a community college acceptance letter I had completed independently. Nobody accompanied me. I worked overnight shifts at a drugstore and attended morning classes. Then transferred to a university and earned my paralegal certificate while waitressing on weekends. I funded every step. I mention this not for validation, but for context. Nobody handed me anything. By 25, I had secured a position as a paralegal at a respected estate planning firm downtown. I excelled at it. My days were spent navigating the financial architectures of others. Organizing the distribution of lives after their owners could no longer hold them. I drafted the mundane pages that determine everything: beneficiary forms, allocation schedules, the precise terminology that dictates who receives what long after the memorial flowers have withered. I could decode a trust document with the same ease others read facial expressions. And the irony that I didn't laugh at for years was this: I could draw an impeccable boundary for a complete stranger. I could inform a grieving widow exactly what she was entitled to and exactly what she was not. But I could not, for any reason, compel my own family to want me. The only person I ever phoned was my grandmother, every Sunday at 4 p.m., without fail, throughout college and beyond. Nana Eleanor. She was the only Ellison who answered the phone as though she had been anticipating my call. And it was something Nana once told me that became the foundation the entire evening balanced upon. Nana Eleanor was my father's mother and the sole adult in that family who ever treated me like a human being rather than a balance sheet entry. She held strong opinions and offered no apologies. When I was 12, crying in her kitchen because Ethan had declared I wasn't a genuine Ellison, she set down her dish towel, cupped my chin, and spoke the words I carried for the next 13 years. You were selected, sweetheart, not acquired. Then she made me a grilled cheese sandwich and let me stay up too late. Nana passed when I was 23. 2 years before that dinner, I delivered the only eulogy that remembered her for her character rather than her assets. Within a month of the funeral, my parents vacated their modest split level and relocated to the larger property on Maple Drive, the estate that had belonged to the family for generations, the one tied to Nana's name in ways I understood more deeply than they realized. I didn't dwell on it at the time. I was mourning. But there was a statement Nana made on one of our final Sundays, her voice fragile over the telephone, that I stored away without comprehension. I made sure she told me that you'll never have to beg anyone for your own existence. I assumed it was encouragement, a grandmother motivating her granddaughter to be resilient. It would be 6 months before that dinner, while examining county records for an unrelated purpose, that I discovered she had meant it literally, in writing. Notarized, the year before I turned 25, my family grew distant in a way that wasn't comfortable. Messages that once received responses within hours now took days. My mother stopped including me in holiday planning chains, then feigned surprise when I arrived at Thanksgiving without a dish nobody had requested me to bring. My Aunt Patricia, meanwhile, grew louder. She had introduced a term into the family group chat she had never used before. Blood, as in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake, as in, the cabin sleeps 8 and we want to restrict it to blood this year. You understand? I did understand. I understood completely. I simply lacked the documentation yet to explain why the climate had shifted so abruptly in that specific season. People don't typically turn cold according to a calendar. Families drift, certainly, but this wasn't drift. This was orchestrated. And the analytical portion of my brain kept signaling alerts, the way you notice 3 unrelated invoices arriving on the same Tuesday and realize they are connected. So when my phone illuminated one March evening with my mother's name and a voice noticeably warmer than it had been in months, I didn't feel complimented. I felt the quiet click of a mechanism engaging somewhere out of sight. Sweetheart, she said, and she only called me sweetheart when she required something. We'd like to take you out to celebrate 25 appropriately. The way we never quite managed. And every instinct I had cultivated over 4 years of analyzing other people's bad news told me the same thing. This is too calculated. Here is what most people misunderstand about my mother. They assume the cruelty is obvious. It isn't. The cruelty is the preparation. The cruelty is a woman who never once arranged a birthday cake, suddenly reserving a private corner at the Harrington and describing it as celebrating you properly. When Margaret becomes generous, it's because a spreadsheet somewhere has indicated the generosity will be repaid. I had observed this my entire existence. I had simply never been the line item before. So, I accepted sweetly the way she had trained me. Then I ended the call and sat at my kitchen table for an extended period, doing what I do. I considered timelines. I considered the house on Maple Drive. I considered the word blood appearing in the group chat precisely now, precisely this season, and a statement my grandmother had made before her death. And I considered the manila folder already resting in my work bag, the one I had compiled 6 months earlier for reasons unrelated to my mother and entirely connected to finally understanding my origins. I didn't contact my parents for clarification. I didn't alert them that I had visited the county clerk. Instead, I made a few quiet arrangements of my own. Discreet ones, the kind you make when you've determined you won't be ambushed. You will be prepared. I won't disclose yet who I contacted. But I will share the principle I follow. The one Nana never verbalized, but taught me regardless. When my mother is sweet, someone at the table is about to lose something. I just ensured this time it wouldn't be me. People assume a narrative like this revolves around money. And I comprehend why. There's a testament somewhere, a property, a folder slid across a table. But sitting in my car in the Harrington parking lot that night, engine off, hands steady on the steering wheel, what I feared losing had no monetary equivalent. I feared losing the final remnant of the belief that I had ever belonged anywhere. Because as cold as that household had been, as transactional as every candle and every casserole, it remained my only origin story. They were still, technically, my parents. And if they severed that tie tonight the way I suspected they intended, then I would become exactly what Ethan had called me at 12. Not a real Ellison. Just a girl someone collected, and later discarded. That was the wound they were targeting, and they knew it because it was the wound they had been aggravating my entire life. What they hadn't accounted for was that the wound had already healed. 6 months can accomplish that if the right people find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, tucked the folder beneath my arm, and crossed that lot with the particular stillness of someone who has read the final chapter of a book everyone else believes is still being written. I wasn't walking toward a disownment. I was walking toward a farewell I had already selected. They simply didn't realize it yet. We ordered beverages before anyone spoke a truthful word. My mother praised the wine selection. My father recounted a parking anecdote he had already shared in the car. And then, somewhere between the bread basket and the main course nobody would finish, Margaret folded her hands and transitioned into that familiar cadence. I know that cadence. It's the one she employed when she returned a gift in my presence and explained why it hadn't been practical. "We have always done our absolute best for you," she began. Thomas nodded along, a half-second behind, the way he had nodded behind her for 30 years. "We provided you with shelter, education, more than many children ever receive." I allowed her to speak. I rested one hand flat on the manila folder beside my plate, and I watched my father's gaze drift downward and then away. The folder had a label on its tab, typed, just the upper edge visible above my fingers. He could glimpse 4 letters if he looked. And he looked. Truss. I covered the remainder with my thumb, not to conceal it, simply to let him speculate. And I observed the speculation beginning to unsettle him. My mother continued about sacrifices, about how a child should appreciate the expense of being raised. And I reflected on a sweating cupcake and one candle, and I said nothing. Then she paused, took a measured sip, set the glass down with the exactness of someone reaching a slide she had rehearsed, and delivered the statement that opened the door to everything. There's something, Claire, that you should have been informed of a very long time ago. You're adopted, my mother said. She announced it the way you might disclose a change to a dinner booking. We adopted you as an infant. You were never biologically ours. I want you to know, we never intended to keep this from you permanently. She observed my face as she spoke, and I understood that she was anticipating the breakdown. This was the moment she had constructed the entire evening around, the corner table and the blazer and the deliberate pauses. All of it engineered to land precisely here, at the instant when her adopted daughter learned she had been a stranger all along and shattered into fragments she could collect and discard. I wish I could tell you it didn't land. It landed. Some part of a person always braces for the floor to be present, and mine had just been told there was no floor. But I had already learned this 6 months ago, and the only thing my mother actually revealed that evening was how little she understood me. She leaned in, almost gentle, and delivered the sentence I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet corners for the rest of my existence. We only kept you for the benefits. She smiled when she said it. That was the detail that ultimately liberated me, not the cruelty. I had been raised on the cruelty. The smile was different. A woman doesn't smile while delivering the most devastating news of your life unless she has repeated it enough times to take pleasure in the performance. And in her smile, I finally perceived the complete picture. I hadn't been a daughter who had failed them. I had been an asset that had fully depreciated. Benefits is an elegant term for an ugly arrangement, and my father, to his disadvantage, attempted to justify it like an accountant defending a deduction. There were assistance payments in the earlier years, Thomas said, avoiding my eyes. The adoption included a small monthly subsidy when you were young, but that ended a long time ago, when you were still in elementary school. There were tax considerations after that, and there was your grandmother, of course, though he didn't reference her by name. He said Nana had maintained certain expectations about family, that adopting you had enabled them to fulfill those expectations, and that fulfilling them had proven, in his precise accounting terminology, worthwhile for a significant number of years. I remained motionless and allowed the mathematics of my childhood to reorganize into its accurate equation. The single cupcake. The hand-me-downs from Ethan that still carried Patricia's return tags. The way the thermostat was lowered in my room first. They hadn't been impoverished. They had been pocketing the difference between what a child costs and what a child generates, and I had been the generator. We invested in you, Thomas said, as if that concluded the discussion. As if a child were a rental property with a depreciation schedule. And then my mother, impatient with his bookkeeping, truncated to the bottom line, the one the entire evening had been constructed to deliver. The subsidy has been absent since you were a child, Claire, and what followed it ends today. You're 25 now. There is simply nothing further that retaining you accomplishes for us. She said it almost regretfully, the way you might note that a coupon had reached its expiration. Now you're not useful. 2 sentences, and they had condensed a quarter-century of being their daughter into a line that had ceased generating income. I reached for my water. My hand did not tremble. I observed that it didn't, and I stored it away as a small, unexpected gift. Then, my father performed the action he had come to perform. He reached into the leather portfolio he had brought. The one I had assumed contained a birthday card, and slid a thin stack of documents across the tablecloth until it rested against my plate. "We've already filed," he said, "to formalize arrangements. You won't be included in the will. You won't be a beneficiary of anything belonging to us. We wanted to handle this cleanly in person, so there would be no confusion later." He had rehearsed cleanly. I could detect the attorney who had coached him. And here is the element I have never been able to make my family comprehend, the element that transformed the entire evening without my uttering a word. I read the heading on the first page in approximately 4 seconds. The way I had read 1,000 similar documents, and I recognized immediately what they had executed. They had filed against the incorrect instrument. They had spent considerable resources removing me from an estate that was nearly irrelevant, while leaving completely untouched the document that actually determined everything. They didn't know what I knew. They believed the authority in this room flowed through their own modest will. And that was where they had directed their expensive little blade. I didn't correct them. You don't inform the opposing party they've sued the wrong defendant. You allow them to finish. So, I slid the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting nor declining, and I let them continue believing they had succeeded. Across the table, my Aunt Patricia's voice arrived via speakerphone from my mother's handbag because, naturally, Patricia was listening because Patricia had been the architect of much of this. "Blood protects blood, Claire," she said, warm as a blade in broth. "You've always understood that." I didn't cry. I want to be honest that a portion of me had expected to, that some 12-year-old still residing in my chest had been prepared for this exact table since the evening Ethan told her she wasn't genuine. But 25-year-old me simply took a deliberate sip of water and placed the glass down without a sound. And I observed something cross my mother's face that I had genuinely never witnessed before. Disappointment, not at me, at the performance. She had written this scene with a weeping protagonist, and the protagonist wasn't weeping, and it was undermining her conclusion. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she asked, and there was an edge in it now. The brittleness of a woman whose script had gone off track. I considered the question. I considered everything I could have expressed, the entire flood of it. 25 years accumulated behind one small dam, and then she committed the error. People like her always commit. She filled the silence by repeating the line that had succeeded the first time, expecting it to succeed again. "We only kept you for the benefits," she repeated, slower this time, emphasizing each word, attempting to extract blood she could observe. But a sentence loses its impact the second time you hear it from the same lips. The first time it had been a revelation. The second time, it was simply a confession, and not about me. It revealed everything about her and nothing about my value. I set my napkin on my lap, smoothed it once, and allowed her to watch me not fracture. Behind her, at table 7, I observed a woman with my exact jawline turn her head toward our table and freeze. To explain the contents of my folder, I need to transport you back 6 months to the week 2 envelopes arrived and recalibrated the mathematics of my entire existence. The first I had been anticipating. After Nana passed, I had finally registered with the State Adoption Reunion Registry, half expecting nothing to result. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived in handwriting I didn't recognize. Careful and looping, the handwriting of a woman who had rehearsed what she wanted to convey. It was from Sarah Mitchell. She wrote that she had been 19 when she placed me, that she hadn't wanted to, that she had thought of me every March for 25 years, and that if I ever wished to meet her, she would travel any distance, any day, with no conditions. She had signed it, and then beneath her name, she had added one more line, the one I read so frequently the paper grew soft. I never stopped reserving a place for you. The second envelope arrived 3 days later, and it had nothing to do with Sarah. Or so I assumed. Our state had only recently unsealed original birth records to adult adoptees, accessible once you turned 21 and applied through the same reunion registry, and I had submitted my request the week Sarah's letter arrived. While I was in the county system awaiting mine, I requested the file on Nana's estate. Professional habit, the way a dentist examines strangers' teeth. And there it was, in the distribution schedule of the Eleanor Ellison Family Trust, executed 2 years before her death, administered not by my parents, but by a financial institution. The caregiver distributions to Thomas and Margaret Ellison, it read, shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter Claire, not their estate. Hers, held by a trustee they couldn't access, scheduled to depart their control permanently on the exact date they had selected for that dinner. 2 envelopes in 1 week. One told me where I originated, the other informed me in my grandmother's notarized script exactly what my parents were about to forfeit, and why they were suddenly in such a rush. I did not contact my mother and announce the discovery. That's not the instrument I possessed. And it's not the instrument I trust. I've observed too many families sacrifice everything to a satisfying outburst that an attorney later converts into evidence. What I possessed was procedure, so I utilized procedure. I took a personal day, transported the trust documents to an estate's attorney with no affiliation to my family, and compensated her from my own funds to verify what I already suspected. The caregiver distributions were legitimate, ongoing, and concluding. My parents had been receiving a monthly sum for raising me and occupying the property the trust financed for nearly 2 decades. The remainder on my 25th birthday transferred to me by the trust's own provisions through a corporate trustee, with nothing my parents could file, sign, or destroy to prevent it. Their will was irrelevant to it. Their disownment was theater performed on an incorrect stage. My attorney asked if I wanted to inform them, get ahead of it, soften the impact. I declined. I stated I wanted 3 items in a folder and nothing more. The retainer letter so they would know I had counsel. The trust's distribution schedule so they would see the date in writing, and my original birth certificate with Sarah Mitchell's name in the mother's line so that when the moment arrived, the table would understand exactly which family I was choosing to depart, and which one I was choosing to embrace. I labeled the tab, and I closed the folder, and I placed it in my bag, and I carried it for 6 months like a quiet engine I hadn't activated yet. The dinner invitation simply indicated when to turn the key. I met Sarah Mitchell for the first time in a diner halfway between our cities because she didn't want me to have to travel too far. And that small thoughtfulness affected me more than any speech could have. She was anxious. She had brought a photo album she kept opening and closing without showing me, as though she wasn't certain she had earned the privilege. She had my jawline and my tendency to fall silent when emotions overwhelmed me. Over 6 months, we constructed something carefully, the way you would repair a bridge while standing on it. I discovered I had a half-brother named Daniel, 19, all limbs and curiosity, who texted me memes within a week of meeting me as if I had always been present to receive them. I discovered my birth grandmother was a tiny, tenacious woman named Helen, who took one look at me and said, "Well, there you are." As if I had simply been delayed, not absent for a quarter century. They never requested anything from me. That was the element my entire nervous system couldn't process. No favors, no money, no role to fulfill. Sarah told me the third time we met the statement that would become the truest sentence of my life. "We've kept a place for you, sweetheart," she said. "We never offered it to anyone else." And I, who could draft a flawless beneficiary clause for a stranger, who knew the precise legal terminology of belonging, sat in a vinyl booth and didn't know what to do with my own hands. Because I had been desired for the first time by people who received nothing from wanting me. After 25 years of being useful, I had no concept of how to simply be welcome. I was about to have to learn quickly. There is a distinction between being needed and being wanted. And I had only ever known one of them. Being needed, I understood completely. Being needed is a function. You appear, you produce, you remain accommodating. You keep the calculations simple. And in exchange, you retain your seat for another quarter. I had been needed my entire existence. And I had mistaken the consistency of it for affection. The way you can mistake a lengthy commute for a destination simply because you travel it every day. What Sarah, Daniel, and Helen offered me had no function attached, and that frightened me more than my mother ever had. The first time Sarah called simply to ask about my week with no hidden purpose, I waited throughout the entire conversation for the condition. And when there wasn't one, I had to pull my vehicle over because I couldn't see the road. I kept testing them in small, uncharitable ways I'm not proud of. I would cancel arrangements to see if they would penalize me. They didn't. They simply said, "No problem. Next time." And they meant it. I would offer to pay for everything to render myself useful, to earn my place. Helen finally cupped my face in her hands the way Nana used to and said, "You don't have to purchase your way in here. We've already covered it." And gradually over those 6 months, a knot I had carried since age 9 began, not to dissolve, but to loosen. I started to believe, against 25 years of evidence, that a person could simply want me in the room. So, when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 25 appropriately, I already knew where I wanted to spend the evening. I just decided to spend it everywhere simultaneously. Here is who I contacted. The evening my mother booked the Harrington, I called Sarah, and I asked her a question I had been too afraid to ask anyone in my existence. "Would you attend my birthday dinner?" I explained the complete shape of it, the parents, the suspicions, the trust, the speech I could sense approaching. I told her I didn't know exactly what they intended to say, but I knew I didn't want to hear it alone, and I knew I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were anticipating. Sarah didn't hesitate for even a moment. She said, "What time and where? And should we dress formally?" Then she said something that caused me to cover my mouth in my kitchen. "We would be honored," she said, "to witness you not needing them." So I made one more call, this one to the Harrington, and I reserved a second table for that same evening under my own name. Claire Ellison, party of 3. Table 7, the host informed me. Near the back, 3 tables behind the reservation already booked for an Ellison party of 3 at the front. I nearly laughed at the symmetry of it. They had no idea they would be performing my disownment within view of the family that had spent 25 years saving me a chair. I instructed Sarah, Helen, and Daniel to arrive slightly after us, to order quietly, to simply be present, and to allow me to come to them when I was prepared. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There is a reason the truth lands more forcefully spoken in front of witnesses than delivered in a letter, and I had observed enough confrontations to recognize that a private one only ever becomes the other party's account against yours. So yes, I wanted witnesses, and I'm not ashamed of that. But Sarah, Helen, and Daniel were never merely witnesses to me. And that was the entire distinction between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I would make my parents understand they had lost. Table 7 was where I would go to remember I had won long before they sat down. Back at the front table in the present, my mother determined the silence had persisted sufficiently and moved to finalize the arrangement. She produced one additional page from the leather portfolio and rotated it to face me, uncapping a pen and placing it across the paper like a small offering. "It's simply an acknowledgement," she said, "that we have informed you, that you comprehend the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner and proceed separately." I examined the page, and I didn't have to read extensively. The release paragraph opened with the exact standard language I had typed hundreds of times myself. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy," and the remainder of it performed what that terminology always performs. It wasn't an acknowledgement, it was a waiver in disguise. A tidy little document designed to secure my agreement on the record that I had been notified and possessed no claim. The kind of document a careful attorney drafts to preempt precisely the challenge I was positioned to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding from the revelation, before the shock subsided and I could think clearly. It's a classic maneuver. I have witnessed grieving individuals sign away inheritances at kitchen tables because someone slid the pen across at the right wounded moment. My mother was depending on my wound. She didn't realize it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen where it rested. My father, across from me, continued glancing at my manila folder, and I observed the anxiety climbing his neck in a gradual red flush. Thomas had always been the one who understood where the money actually resided. He had seen the 4 letters on the tab. He was performing the arithmetic now, the same arithmetic I had conducted 6 months earlier, and I could perceive the answer was beginning to unsettle him. "Is there?" he started, then stopped. "Is there something we should know, Claire?" I smiled at him, the first genuine smile of the evening. "Not yet," I said. That was when my Aunt Patricia arrived in person with Ethan trailing behind her. Both of them feigning surprise like people who had been waiting in the lounge for a signal. "Claire, what a coincidence," Patricia said, pressing a cold cheek to mine. And I understood instantly that Margaret had summoned reinforcements. My mother preferred an audience for her finest performances, and she especially preferred one that would nod in agreement and exert pressure if I became difficult. Patricia pulled up a chair without being invited. Ethan, 26 and still dressing as though his mother selected his wardrobe, gave me a look I had been receiving since childhood. The look that communicated you were always destined to remain at the children's table eventually. Patricia proceeded directly to the point. Subtlety had never been her instrument. "We simply want what's best for the family," she said, placing a manicured hand over my mother's. "And families have to make difficult decisions about who truly belongs. You've always been such a practical girl, Claire. You understand that blood protects blood." There it was again. That term, the one she had been embedding in the group chat all year, finally spoken aloud at the table it had been constructed for. I looked at my aunt, who had responded for my mother the day I turned 8, and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a celebration, and I felt the final thread of obligation in me release. These were not people I was losing. These were people I was setting down. I had carried them a long distance, longer than they deserved, and my arms were finally, wonderfully exhausted. Across the table, my father wasn't participating. He was staring at his hands. And then, while Patricia was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, Thomas leaned toward me and said something quietly. "Just for me." "Your grandmother loved you," my father said very softly beneath Patricia's commentary. He stopped there. For a moment I observed the entire alternate version of Thomas Ellison, the one who might have existed if he had ever once selected a difficult decision over an easy one. His eyes were moist. He had loved his mother. I knew that much was true, and some part of him understood that the woman he had loved had constructed a barrier around me with her own funds, precisely because she didn't trust her son to protect me. That had to be a terrible realization to sit with at a dinner table. I waited. I genuinely waited, because there was a version of that evening where my father articulated the next sentence. The apology. The "I'm sorry. This is wrong. I won't do this." And I would have heard it, and it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was observing him the way a handler observes a dog that has wandered toward the road. And I observed him choose. He sat back. He lifted his water. And the almost sentence perished in his throat where so many of his almost sentences had perished over the years. That was the closest approximation to affection anyone at the front table offered me all evening. And it lasted 4 words and a swallow. I didn't resent him for it. You can't resent someone for being exactly the weight you always knew they were. But I understood finally that the reason they had filed in such haste, the reason for the entire rushed, cruel evening, was sitting behind his moist eyes. He knew about Nana's trust. He had known the date was approaching. And he had hoped desperately to obtain my signature on a waiver before I ever discovered what his mother had arranged for me. So, I asked him a question, not loudly, not as a daughter. I asked it in the voice I use at the firm when I have identified the flaw in someone's filing, and I am offering them the dignity of recognizing it themselves. "Dad," I said. "Which instrument did you file against? Your estate or Nana's trust?" The table fell silent in a new manner. My mother's wine glass halted on its journey to her lips. Patricia's manicured hand stopped patting. Thomas blinked at me, as though I had started communicating in a language he half recognized from a country he had never visited, because in 8 words I had conveyed 3 things they hadn't anticipated. That I knew there was a distinction between the two. That I knew which one mattered. And that I had known long enough to have mastered the terminology. My mother had never heard me use that voice before. None of them had. To them, I had always been the quiet one, the accommodating one, the girl who accepted the smaller portion so the table could remain pleasant. They had constructed this entire evening on the assumption that I would receive my fate, not audit it. "What?" my mother said, and it emerged smaller than she intended. "What are you talking about?" I allowed the question to linger. I have learned that the most powerful individual in any room is the one who doesn't need to rush toward the answer. I rotated my water glass a quarter turn on the cloth, aligned it with the edge of the manila folder, and I looked at my father, who had gone very pale, and who already knew, and who was silently pleading with me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. I didn't dramatize it. There was no flourish, no slammed document, no theatrical speech. I simply rotated the folder so it faced them, and I arranged the 3 pages on the white cloth, side by side, the way I would present exhibits to a client who needed to understand their own circumstances. The retainer letter, first, with the firm's letterhead, and the unmistakable line confirming that I was represented by counsel. The distribution schedule of the Eleanor Ellison Family Trust, second, with the relevant paragraph already displayed in print for anyone at the table to read, and third, my original birth certificate with Sarah Mitchell's name, where my mother had assumed her own name belonged. I didn't gesture at anything. I allowed the paper to accomplish what paper accomplishes. My mother's eyes traveled to the trust schedule first, because of course they did, because some instinctive part of her had always known where the assets resided. I observed her reading it. I observed the words registering. The caregiver distributions to Thomas and Margaret Ellison shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter Claire. I observed her reach the word remainder and the word Claire. And I observed the color drain from her face from the top downward, like a curtain being lowered. She looked up at me, and then at Thomas, and then back at the page, the way people do when they're hoping the second reading will deliver something kinder than the first. It didn't. It never does. "Mom," I said gently, because I could afford to be gentle now. "You filed against the wrong family. The one you removed me from was always the smaller one. My mother is a quick woman, and I will acknowledge that. Even now, it required approximately 10 seconds for her to assemble the complete picture, and I observed her doing it in real time. The house on Maple Drive, financed by the trust that she had assumed she would occupy permanently. The monthly distributions that had quietly supported her comfortable existence and that ceased by their own terms tonight. The remainder, the actual assets, the portion she had spent 2 decades adjacent to and never controlling, transferring on this exact date to the daughter she had just informed she was finished with. And the waiver, her clever little waiver that I had been moments from signing, that would have been worth precisely nothing because it released a claim on an estate that was never where the value resided. She had aimed every weapon she possessed at a will and overlooked the trust entirely. The cruelty had been cost-free. The miscalculation had been costly. And here is where I learned the final lesson my mother had to teach me, which is that people like her never apologize at the moment they're exposed. They pivot. Her face rearranged itself, the coldness draining away and a terrible warmth flooding in. And she reached across the table for my hand. "Claire," she said, and her voice had gone soft and moist and maternal in a way it had never once been when it cost her anything. "We're still your parents. Whatever's in those documents, that doesn't alter what we are. We're family." The word family from the mouth that 20 minutes earlier had said, "We only kept you for the benefits." I looked at her hand, reaching for mine, and I did not take it. The same sentence that had been her weapon was now, in this light, the confession that cleared me to leave. People expect this is the part where I made them pay, where I detailed exactly what the remainder was worth, watched them squirm, maybe ordered the most expensive item on the menu and left them the bill. I understand the appetite for it. I've felt it. But I want to tell you the truth about power because I handle it for a living. The strongest position in any room isn't the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that doesn't need the number at all. I had a career I'd built with my own hands. I had savings I'd earned waiting tables and drafting documents. I did not need Nana's remainder to be free. And that more than any dollar figure was what my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the 3 pages back into it unhurried, and I kept the pen they had brought for my surrender and set it neatly beside her plate. I'd won the thing they thought we were fighting over before any of them sat down. And I'd won it by knowing, by preparing, by refusing to be ambushed. There was nothing left to argue. There was only the choice of where to spend the rest of my birthday. And I'd made that choice 6 months ago in a vinyl diner booth when a nervous woman with my jawline slid a photo album across a table and didn't ask me for a single thing. I administer estates for a living, and I'll tell you what I tell every client who's being circled by people who only appear when there's something to gain. If someone in your life shows up only when you're useful, you already know what that is, and no amount of shared history makes it love. I stood up. I did it the way you'd rise from any table. No drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for her folder. But the effect on the front table was immediate. My mother's hand was still hanging in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she said, and the soft maternal mask slipped, and the old cold control snapped back into her voice like a bone setting. "Sit down, Claire. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Renee straightened. Brett for once stopped smirking. My father just looked tired, the look of a man watching the only good thing his mother ever did walk out of his reach forever. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest. And I looked at my mother, who had spent 25 years in an expensive dinner trying to make me understand that I had no real place anywhere, and I told her where I was going in the plainest words I owned. "My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. The sentence had been true for the entire meal. True while she smiled and rehearsed and slid her waiver across the cloth. True the whole time. She believed she was performing my disownment to an audience of strangers. She hadn't been performing it to strangers. She'd been performing it within arm's reach of the people who'd been saving me a chair since before she ever decided I'd stopped being useful. And I watched my words travel across the table and land. And I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn around in her seat. My mother turned around slowly, the way you turn when some part of you already knows and is begging the rest of you to be wrong. The wool shoulders rotated, her chin came around, and there at table 7, 3 tables back, beneath the warm low light, were Sarah, Helen, and Daniel, who had been there the entire time, who had ordered quietly and eaten almost nothing, who had watched my mother deliver the worst sentences of my life, and had kept their seats and their composure because I'd asked them to let me come to them. Sarah met my mother's eyes first. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She just looked at the woman who had raised her daughter on 1 candle and a calculator. And then she looked at me, and her whole face opened like a window in spring. Helen, small and ferocious, had her napkin already folded by her plate, ready. Daniel had stopped pretending to look at his phone. My mother's gaze went from Sarah's jawline to mine and back again, doing the resemblance math. And I saw the exact moment she understood that the family she just told me I didn't have was sitting 15 feet behind her in real chairs at a real table. Having watched her do the one thing she could never take back in front of witnesses she didn't know she had. She turned back to me, and her mouth opened, and nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script. And in the silence where her next cruel line should have been, a chair scraped back at table 7. They stood up, all 3 of them, not to make a scene, not to confront anyone, just to be on their feet when I crossed the room to them the way you stand for someone arriving at a gate after a long flight. Helen stood first, because Helen does everything first, and then Sarah, and then Daniel, knocking his knee on the table leg in his hurry. They didn't say a word to my parents. They didn't have to. Their standing said the entire thing. The restaurant had gone quiet around us, the particular hush of strangers who can feel that something true is happening and have stopped pretending not to watch. A waiter froze with a tray. And I walked past my mother, who was still turned half around in her chair. Past Patricia, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood. Past my father, who lifted his eyes to me as I passed, and then dropped them again, choosing comfort one last time. 15 feet, 3 tables, 25 years. When I reached them, Helen took my face in both her hands, the way Nana used to, and Sarah pulled out the empty chair beside her own, the 4th chair, the one they had asked the host to set, even though their reservation was for 3. And she said the words she'd written under her name in that first letter. The words that had gone soft from my reading them. "We saved you a seat," she said. "We always did." And I sat down in it. The seat that had been waiting my whole life at the table that had wanted me before they knew if I'd ever come. That was when my mother lost the one thing she'd never lost in front of people. Her composure. I heard her chair scrape, heard her stand, heard the front table calm she'd worn all evening crack straight down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, and it wasn't quiet anymore. It carried across the dining room, sharp and rising. "After everything we did for you, the schools, the roof, the years, you do this to us in public. You humiliate your family over money." Heads turned now openly. A man at the bar set down his drink. Patricia was tugging at my mother's sleeve, hissing, "Margaret, sit down. People are looking." But my mother was past the reach of her own handler for the first time in her life, because the script was gone. And all she had left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said to a room full of strangers. And I noticed she said gave, not loved. Even now, even cornered, the word love would not come because it had never been in the inventory. I stayed in my seat at table 7. I didn't stand to match her. I didn't raise my voice to meet hers. Sarah's hand had found mine under the table, and I just held it and let my mother be loud, because the loudness was doing my work for me. Every person in that restaurant was watching a calm young woman seated quietly with people who clearly adored her, and a furious older woman shouting about everything she'd paid for. And there is not a human being alive who hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, "Ah, there's the real family." My father never stood at all. He just put his face in his hands. I let her run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain. And when the quiet came back, I did one last thing before I gave the rest of my attention to my actual family. I stood, walked the 3 tables back to the front, and set a single page down on the white cloth in front of her, the trust's distribution schedule. I left it face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals, and I wanted my mother to have something to read on the longest evening of her life. "You can keep this one," I said. "You'll want to understand what ended today and what didn't." She stared at the page. Thomas reached for it, and then didn't. And I looked at the two of them. My mother, who had priced me at 1 candle, and my father, who had loved his own mother too much to honor what she'd asked of him, and I said the only sentence I'd prepared in advance, the one I'd written in my head in the parking lot, and decided I'd only use if I earned it. "You kept me for the benefits," I said. "They kept a seat for me." Then I turned around and I walked back to table 7, and I did not look behind me again. Not once. Not when Patricia called my name. Not when my mother said something I couldn't hear and didn't want to. I sat back down beside Sarah. Helen had ordered me a slice of chocolate cake while I was gone, and Daniel had stuck the little restaurant candle in it, a single candle lit. And for 1 second, the symmetry of it caught in my throat. Then Sarah leaned over and said, "Blow it out, sweetheart, make the wish." And I realized I didn't have one. I already had it. The trust did exactly what my grandmother built it to do. On my 25th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Thomas and Margaret Ellison ended on the date and by the terms Nana had notarized 2 years before she died. The remainder passed to me through the bank trustee, untouched by the will my parents had spent good money revising. Because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you don't control. Their waiver, unsigned, was worth what it was always worth. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Maple Drive because without the distributions, they couldn't carry it and moved into something smaller. And I am told Patricia was furious to learn that none of Nana's money would be flowing toward Ethan after all. The story of that dinner traveled the way these stories do through the family and then past it. And the version where Margaret Ellison is the devoted mother wronged by an ungrateful adopted daughter never quite took because too many strangers at the Harrington had watched a woman scream about everything she'd paid for while a quiet girl held hands with the family across the room. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post anything. I simply stopped answering, and I let the silence be the boundary, which is the only kind that ever holds. My father texted me once a few weeks later. 3 words. "I am sorry." No name signed, no follow-up. When I didn't reply, I never replied. I heard later that when Patricia tried to rally the family to contest Nana's trust, it was Thomas who quietly shut it down, told them their mother had every right to leave her money where she pleased, that it was hers, that it was finished. He was right. He was also, as ever, a year too late, and saying it to the wrong room, when it cost him nothing and changed nothing. That was the whole of my father in the end. A man who knew the right thing, even felt it, and could only ever bring himself to do it once doing it had stopped requiring anything of him. I didn't need the apology, but I was glad. In a small, clean way that he'd finally been right out loud. As for the rest of it, I spent that first real birthday eating chocolate cake at table 7 with people who got nothing from wanting me. And I have spent every birthday since with them. Sarah and I talk every Sunday now, at 4:00, the hour I used to save for Nana. Helen taught me to make her grilled cheese. Daniel still sends memes. And somewhere in a drawer at my new family's kitchen, there is a photo album that doesn't close anymore, because it finally has enough pages. Being useful was all my parents ever wanted from me, and being wanted was the one thing I'd never had. And it took me 25 years and one terrible dinner to learn that anyone who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you in the plainest language there is that they were never your family at all. That's my story. 1 candle for 24 years. And on the 25th, a whole table that lit them all without being asked. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You don't have to earn the people who love you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.